your point, with the coverage of Sam Bankman-Fried, here you have a situation where this is, by the way, Sam, his company FTX was launched the same day as Biden launched his presidential campaign. I don't know if you know that, but it was a bit of a coincidence there. The U.S. government has a choice. Either they can make Bitcoin legal tender and start stacking Bitcoin like the president of El Salvador, or they can try to regulate Bitcoin and attack Bitcoin and be left out of the 21st century financial revolution that is Bitcoin. There's a lot of confusion now, Bitcoin and crypto and what happened with FTX. But in the case of Bitcoin, it's designed to be attacked and it's designed to be disruptive, which means that the hash rate, which is the underlying algorithm that gives it its power, gets stronger, which means it gets more secure and therefore the price goes higher. So it's a unique piece of technology that people either love it or hate it. It's almost like a litmus test. If you're essentially a corrupt individual, you become more corrupt, like Sam Bankman-Fried. He was born a corrupt individual. Bitcoin made him more corrupt. If you're somebody who's more noble with intentions, like a Michael Saylor, it elevates you to greater heights of what was underlying a noble instinct. And Bitcoin has the power to do that. And so what we're seeing now is really another chapter in the history of Bitcoin where the traditional finance is imploding. The central banks are nervous. The central banks are having hearings. Christine Lagarde is quite upset because she says that Bitcoin is an escape hatch. And of course she's right, because you're escaping the central bank system, the fiat money system, with money that allows people to have unconfiscatable property that's completely outside of the current system. And that scares people. If you have a population owning unconfiscatable property that cannot be assailed by any authority, it's completely decentralized. And that's why it's causing the shockwaves around the world. Sam Bankman-Fried, the key to his empire of fraud is that he created his own play money token called FTT. And he was able to create that without any oversight or any tie to anything underlying giving it value whatsoever. And this is a whole cryptographic scam that's been going on with the crypto market where individuals, and he's not the only one, there are many people that create these what are called altcoins or scam coins. And they create, Ether is another one, or Cardano or XRP. These are all coins that are just created, and then they list these coins on each other's exchange, and then they buy them from each other to create a price, and then they use the enhanced price, which is now has a collateral value, to go buy something like Sam Bankman-Fried did, real estate in the Bahamas. Right. So it's a Ponzi scheme. It's a fraud. And implied in the Sam Bankman-Fried crisis scam is none other than Gary Gensler over at the SEC, who should have been calling time on this a long ago, but we find out that he's actually involved and that there's some what I would call collusion. And the problem is in America, you have a country that's ruled by a kleptocracy. Every institution in America is tied to Wall Street in some way. They've all been financialized. They all use cheap money. They're all cross-collateralizing each other's assets. They're all using that money to buy real assets. And they're all undermining the economy in fundamental ways, which lead to inflation, which lead to unemployment, which lead to all kinds of dysfunctions in the economy, in our medical system, in all across the institutions. It all goes back to essentially the deregulation that happened 40 years ago, which led to the financialization and the over-indebtedness, the over-leveraging of the economy. And now in 2022, since interest rates are going up, that's the end of the mirage, that the bubble has been popped. And the FTX scandal and the Sam Bankman-Fried scandal was like the last dregs of a 40-year bacchanal in cheap money, no regulation, and crooked bankers. It's central planning. It's not capitalism at all. Don't blame capitalism for the ills of the American economy, because we don't live in a capitalist society. We live in a command and control society where the fundamental element of the economy, money, the price of that money is set by the Central Committee, the Politburo, known as the FOMC. That's not a market-driven economy. So that's problem number one. Bitcoin solves this, because Bitcoin is not controlled by anyone. It is pure market driven. And the price of Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin is dictated purely by people's willingness to have or need to have an unconfiscatable, uncensorable way to own property outside of what they see as a very big corrupt system. That is that Bitcoin beats the kleptocracy. Bitcoin beats the inherent fraud and the problems in the U.S. economy, as it has now descended into what would almost be argued a permanent state of dysfunction by a captured regulators, venal, ineffective politicians, and a media, present company excluded, but a media that's also in their pocket as well. So we have really a crisis. Like the Financial Times is essentially a Bible on committing financial fraud. The Wall Street Journal is essentially the playbook on how to commit financial fraud. The typical financial media at CNBC really talk about fraud. There's nothing inherently with any integrity whatsoever in these financial markets. But to your point, with the coverage of Sam Bankman-Fried, here you have a situation where this is, by the way, Sam, his company FTX was launched the same day as Biden launched his presidential campaign. I don't know if you know that, but it was a bit of a coincidence there. As I explained a little bit earlier, so let's dig into this. After Bitcoin was created, a lot of people decided that they could come up with digital currencies that were going to be that could be used as scams. Essentially, it was very easy to create play money, and I did this myself, as I mentioned, in the 1990s when I did the Hollywood Stock Exchange. I created a virtual currency as part of that game, so I know this market very, very well. These tokens that are being created in the trillions, they have their purpose is solely to be picked up by this cartel, if you will, of VCs. Out in California, Sequoia, you mentioned, is part of it, and others who are involved in a collusion in racketeering. This is the thing about it, Tucker, is that they're involved in a clear-cut case of criminal enterprise. It's a criminal enterprise. It's a racket. They need to be going after with RICO. The Andreessen Horowitz, Sam Bankman-Fried, Sequoia, BlackRock, they're involved in a criminal enterprise and a racket by boosting the price of worthless tokens on each other's exchanges and then using that token as collateral to fund things like, oh, the war machine in Ukraine, oh, Joe Biden's re-election campaign, oh, the midterms, which we now know was highly influenced by money that was manufactured out of thin air. They can't get the money from Congress. They can't get the money from their donors. So they created this entity called FTX, which is a huge slush fund. Essentially, it's a slush fund disguised as a crypto exchange, which is managed by somebody. The way I see Sam Bankman-Fried, he's kind of a cross between Bernie Madoff and Charles Manson, right? Because he's got his little cadre of drug-addled sex maniacs in the Bahamas, and he's perpetrating the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. Larcenistic criminal who's down there perpetrating the biggest fraud in history, and they're the Democrats are like, yeah, I'll take your money because we're morally in need. It doesn't matter when the money is stolen. Our moral agenda means that we can take stolen money because that's the way we are. We need to fight over there in Ukraine. We need to make all the, the moral turpitude of the Democrats is insanely over the top. So, but they've run out of money. So they had to resort to this, essentially this racket. And the racket, you can go back and you can trace the origins of it to the past few decades where we've had very similar instances of financial fraud and abuse. The 2008 crisis I mentioned, the S&L crisis, long-term capital management, if you remember that, the late 90s. The hope is always that the Fed will bail you out. The hope is always that the financiers will bail you out, that there will be no accountability. And the question is, well, why wouldn't they have that assumption? Because when in the last 40 years have these financiers not gotten bailed out? When has any of them gone to jail? Same thing in the 2008 crisis. Same thing with the FTX crisis. They're banking on the feds bailing them out. Is this guy in jail? So the basic fuel for financial fraud is cheap money.
Yes.
And the central bank which is now, okay, reluctantly raising rates. They should have been raising rates years ago because that's the role of the central bank, price stability. And they needed to come in and proactively make sure that the malinvestment and the abuse was curtailed by making the cost of abuse and financial fraud high. That's what a higher interest rate does. If you have an idea like, oh, I'm Sam Bankman-Fried, I'm going to create this $32 billion financial fraud, and I'm going to use borrowed money, which, by the way, the cost of that borrowed money is nothing. You know, there's no incentive not to do that. And
Right.
if I mess up, I'm going to get bailed out. I always say that if you took fraud out of the American economy, there would be nothing left. It's an economy run almost entirely on fraud. And fraud is celebrated. Like the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. People don't see that as a cautionary tale and they should avoid committing fraud. It's used as a playbook by this generation. Like, I'm going to steal whatever I can as fast as I can. It is, at the end of the day, kind of sad because they are literally throwing the country under the bus. El Salvador is now the shining city on the hill. El Salvador is now where hope lives in the world because you have a president who recognized the potential of Bitcoin early, who recognized that everything else was garbage. And none of these scandals are hitting El Salvador right now. There's no FTX scandal. There's no Mike Novogratz. There's no Charles Hoskinson. There's no Brock Pierce in El Salvador because he pushed them all out. And now they formally created a Bitcoin office. They formally created new securities laws, which will open the way for volcano bonds. So they're going to escape the IMF by producing their own volcano bond financing mechanism, which I'm consulting on. The central bank digital currency is effectively, they're going to bypass the banking system. One of the reasons why they're doing this is because the banks, once again, need to be bailed out. But the feds are going to let the banks swing in the wind, and they're going to go directly to consumer, and you're going to get your money directly from the central bank. So the big banks on Wall Street who are looking for a bailout this time, they're going to be surprised. They're going to be left to rot. The U.S. government has a choice. Either they can make Bitcoin legal tender and start stacking Bitcoin like the president of El Salvador, who's had an enormous Bitcoin-related gift and his economy is now the shining city on the hill, or they can try to regulate Bitcoin and attack Bitcoin and be left out of the 21st century financial revolution that is Bitcoin.